Hello, and welcome to this channel. This is a quiet place for stories told slowly, where history is not rushed, and voices are gentle enough to listen in the dark. Here we explore lives from the past, not through noise or drama, but through calm moments, hidden thoughts, and the silence between events. Night settled over Alexandria like a thin veil. It was not completely dark, because the moon still hung high in the sky, gently lighting the rooftops and the white stone columns. From far away, the sound of the sea rolled in like a slow, steady breath. The wind passed through the palace gardens, brushing softly against the palm leaves, making them rustle as if someone were speaking in a whisper so quiet that no one would wake. In a silent corner of the palace, there was a small room overlooking the river. An oil lamp stood on a low table, its yellow flame flickering, sometimes bright, sometimes dim, as if it too were growing sleepy. On the walls, shadows stretched long and soft. Everything was calm. Only the sound of water and wind remained, blending into an ancient, gentle song. Cleo was sitting near the window. She was still very young, not yet old enough to be called a queen. Yet her eyes already carried an unusual stillness, like the deep surface of the Nile when night arrives. Cleo rested her chin on her hand and looked down at the flowing river. The water carried the moonlight, pulling it into a long silver ribbon, then breaking it into small fragments as ripples passed. In this palace, people often spoke of great things: feasts, meetings, whispers behind curtains. Names were lifted up and set down like pieces on a game board. But tonight, Cleo did not think about those things. She only listened. She listened to the wind and the water, as if listening to a story the world had been telling for a very long time. Soft footsteps sounded behind her. A woman entered, holding a small scroll. She was Cleo's teacher, an elderly scholar whose voice was always slow, as though every word was placed carefully. She did not ask what Cleo was thinking. She simply set the scroll on the table and stood by the window, looking out at the river with her. Every night before sleep, Cleo liked to hear a story, not a joke, not a child's tale. Cleo preferred true stories, stories of kings, of distant lands, of sea routes, and of promises people once made beneath the sky. The teacher spoke softly, almost like a lullaby. Long ago, before Alexandria became bright and grand, before the palace rose high, the Nile was already here. It flowed through sand and stone, through fields and villages, through the lives of countless people. The Egyptians called it the breath of the land. Without it, the soil would dry, the crops would die, and even dreams would have nowhere to rest. Cleo stared at the water without blinking. She imagined the Nile as a long serpent made of moonlight, winding through the darkness. It did not hurry, and it did not stop. It simply moved forward, like time itself. The teacher continued, speaking of old dynasties, of pharaohs who once stood on stone steps and spoke words that made everyone bow their heads. She told of giant statues resting silently in the desert, of temples with tall columns where people burned incense and prayed for the gods to protect their harvests. Cleo listened, then asked a question, simple and light like a breath. If the Nile was here before everyone else, does it remember anyone? The teacher paused, letting the question settle. Then she smiled. Perhaps it does not remember the way people do, but it flows past every life. It touches hands that are gone. It reflects faces that are forgotten. In that way, it carries everyone with it. Cleo did not answer. She only watched. The moonlight on the river continued to move. In those moments, She felt close to something larger than the palace, larger than names, something wide and deep, like water. She was born into the Ptolemaic family, where power was like a flame held in the hand, warming and dangerous at once. Cleo had heard whispers that adults thought she could not understand, sentences cut short when she entered the room, glances exchanged, then turned away. But Cleo had learned how to observe. She knew that in the palace, many things were never spoken aloud. Many worries rested beneath the table, like stones under the river. The water flowed, but the stones remained. She was not afraid, but she knew she must listen carefully. During the day, she studied letters. She learned to read long scrolls filled with symbols shaped like pictures. She learned about lands around the Mediterranean, the names of islands, cities, and trade routes traveled by ships. She learned Greek, the language of scholars, and slowly learned the Egyptian tongue as well, soft and deep like fertile soil. Night was her favorite time. At night, no one asked her to appear strong. No one required her to sit straight like a statue. Night. She was allowed to sigh. She was allowed to look at the river and ask questions without answers. The teacher handed her the scroll on the table. "This is an old record," she said, "about a year when the river rose high and saved the land from hunger. The ancients wrote that it was a gift from the gods. Others said it was the rule of seasons, of winds, of rains far away." Cleo touched the scroll. The paper was thin, but the story was heavy. Heavy with gratitude. Heavy with the understanding that some things cannot be controlled. Cleo looked at the oil lamp. Its flame was small but steady. It reminded her of a human life, burning for a time, then fading. Yet while it burned, it could warm a room, light a line of text, make the night feel shorter. The teacher gently placed a light shawl over Cleo's shoulders. "It is late," she said. "Tomorrow you must study again." Cleo still looked at the river, but her eyes began to grow heavy, not from exhaustion, but because the night was too gentle. Because the water and wind moved in steady rhythm. Because the entire palace seemed to be sleeping together. Before standing up, Cleo whispered, as if speaking only to herself, "One day I will understand where the Nile wishes to carry this land." The teacher did not reply at once. She simply placed a hand on Cleo's head, warm and quiet, like a blessing. Cleo walked to her bed. Thin fabrics fell around her, soft as clouds. The oil lamp was blown out, and the light disappeared. But the darkness was not frightening. It was only a door, opening into a quieter place. Outside, the Nile continued to flow. The moon continued to shine, and inside the palace of Alexandria, the little girl Cleo closed her eyes, carrying within her a long river, a long story, and a sleep that arrived gently and slowly, as if history itself were singing her to rest. Night returned to Alexandria with the same patient softness, as if it had never left. The sky deepened into a dark blue that felt like velvet, and the moon rose slowly, unhurried, above the city's pale rooftops. In the palace gardens, the air carried the scent of watered earth and sleeping flowers. A fountain whispered to itself, and somewhere beyond the walls, the sea continued its steady breathing against the shore. In a long corridor lined with stone pillars, oil lamps burned with small, careful flames. Their light did not chase the darkness away. It only warmed it, turning shadow into something gentle and familiar. The palace was quieter at this hour. The voices of the day put away like folded cloth. The footsteps of officials and servants softened by distance and sleep. Cleo walked without haste. She was older now, no longer the child who sat with her chin in her palm and asked whether the Nile remembered faces. She moved with a quiet certainty, not loud, not demanding, but steady, like water finding its path. Her hair was gathered back, and a thin shawl rested on her shoulders. In the dim light, her face looked calm, yet her eyes held the kind of wakefulness that did not belong to youth alone. She carried a small bundle of scrolls close to her chest. At the end of the corridor was a room that belonged to learning more than to ceremony. It was not grand in the way the throne room was grand. It did not glitter. It did not echo. It felt like a place where thought could settle. Shelves held rolled papyrus and bound writings, jars of ink, reed pens, wax tablets. On one wall hung a map of the Mediterranean, drawn in careful lines, with names written in Greek. Another wall displayed a smaller chart, older, marked with the curves of the Nile and the ancient names of places that had endured longer than kingdoms. A lamp sat on a low table, and beside it, a shallow bowl of water reflected the flame. Cleo entered as if entering a sanctuary. An elderly scholar sat there, bent over a tablet, his hands stained faintly with ink. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. His face was lined, but his eyes were clear. He did not rise quickly, nor did he bow too deeply. Those gestures belonged to politics. This room belonged to something else. "You are late," he said, but his voice was mild. Cleo smiled in a small way. "The day kept holding on to me." The scholar gestured to the seat opposite him. "Then we will let the night have you." Cleo sat down, placing her scrolls on the table. The papyrus made a soft sound, like dry leaves. She ran her fingers along the edge of one scroll, not opening it yet, as though listening through touch. Outside the window, the city lay under moonlight. A distant bell sounded once and then fell quiet again. The world seemed to exhale. The scholar leaned back slightly. "Tell me," he said, "what did you learn today that did not come from a scroll?" Cleo looked at the flame in the lamp. The fire flickered, steady enough to trust, restless enough to feel alive. "I learned," she said slowly, "that words can be used like doors. They can open, or they can close." The scholar did not interrupt. He waited, as though silence itself were part of the lesson. "In the morning," Cleo continued, "I listened to men discuss grain shipments from the south. They spoke as if the Nile were a servant who could be ordered. They spoke of taxes and storage and the cost of transportation. And yet when the discussion ended, one of them said quietly that the river has been lower than it should be." Her voice remained soft, but something steady moved beneath it. "They spoke of numbers," she went on, "but what I heard was fear." The scholar's gaze rested on her with approval that did not need to be shown. "And what did you do with that fear?" he asked. Cleo lowered her eyes for a moment. "Nothing," she admitted. "Not openly. I only remembered it. I carried it the way one carries water in a jar, carefully, without spilling." The scholar nodded once, as though she had answered correctly. "That," he said, "is how a ruler begins. Not with commands, but with attention." Cleo's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her shawl. She did not say she wanted to be a ruler. In the palace, wanting was dangerous. Wanting was something others could smell. But she did not deny it either. The night did not require denial. The scholar reached toward the scrolls she had brought. "What is this?" he asked. Cleo slid the top one forward. "A copy of a treaty," she said, "between Egypt and a city across the sea, and another scroll about the taxes that followed it." I read them twice, but the meaning keeps shifting when I think I understand it. The scholar unrolled a portion, scanning the lines in Greek. The lamp made the ink look almost wet. Meaning shifts, he said, because people shift. The words stay still, but the hands that hold them change. Cleo watched him read. She liked the way he read, slowly, not swallowing the lines too quickly. She had learned that rushing through knowledge was like drinking too fast. It left you thirsty again. He set the scroll down. "Tell me," he said, "why does Egypt sign treaties at all?" Cleo did not answer immediately. She listened first, as she always did, to what lay beneath the question. "Because Egypt is not alone," she said at last. "Because other powers watch us. Because ships move across the water, and with them hunger and wealth and armies and stories." The scholar's mouth curved in something like a smile. "Yes. And because strength is not always seen in war. Sometimes it is seen in the choice to avoid war." Cleo looked down at the bowl of water. The flame's reflection trembled with the slightest movement of air. "What if avoiding war invites it?" she asked, and her voice was very quiet. The scholar considered her carefully. "That can happen," he said. "And what do you do then?" Cleo thought of the corridor voices, the whispered sentences that ended when she entered. She thought of how the palace could feel like a chessboard where the pieces breathed. "You prepare," she said. "Not loudly, not so people notice, but you prepare." The scholar's eyes held hers. "And how do you prepare?" Cleo's answer came slowly, like a careful step onto stone that might be wet. "You learn," she said. "You learn what people want. You learn what they fear. You learn what they will pretend not to see. You learn languages. You learn names. You learn the shape of the world beyond the palace walls." The scholar nodded. "And you learn yourself," he added. Cleo did not look away. "That is the hardest," she said. The night deepened. The lamp flame drew a small circle of warmth around them. Beyond it, the room was shadowed and still. The palace seemed far away, as if it had become only a thought. The scholar reached for another scroll and unrolled it. The writing on it was older, the characters slightly different, written by a hand long gone. "This," he said, "is a history of rulers. Not only Egyptian, but Greek, Persian, Roman. It is not a story to entertain you. It is a mirror. I want you to read it and tell me what you see." Cleo leaned forward. She read the lines slowly. Some names were familiar, spoken in the halls by men who wanted to sound learned. Others were distant, like stars you could see but never touch. As she read, her face remained calm. But inside her, something unfolded. Each account of a ruler's rise and fall felt like a wave, not violent, but inevitable. Ambition, alliance, betrayal, miscalculation, pride, mercy. The patterns were different, yet they carried the same shape. She stopped at a passage about a ruler who trusted too easily, who believed words more than actions, and lost what he should have guarded. She read it again, then a third time. The scholar watched her. "What do you see?" Cleo's voice was soft. "I see that people do not change," she said. "They only wear different clothes." The scholar's expression softened. "That is a strong thought for someone so young," he said. Cleo did not smile. "I do not feel young," she said, and the truth of it surprised even her. The scholar did not push her to explain. He understood what it meant to live in a palace where childhood was not protected like a garden flower. Here, childhood was something that could be taken by a glance, a rumor, a decision made in another room. He rolled the scroll back up and set it aside. "Tell me," he said, "how many languages do you speak now?" Cleo's eyes lowered. "Greek," she said, "and Egyptian, and I can read Latin, though slowly, and I can understand some of the traders' tongues, but not well." The scholar nodded. "You are building keys," he said. "Each language opens a door, and the more doors you can open, the fewer people can trap you behind one." Cleo looked toward the window. Far away beyond the city, the Nile moved through darkness like a secret. "Sometimes," she said, "I wonder if the Nile is a language too." The scholar did not laugh. He understood her way of thinking. "It is," he said. "It speaks in flood and drought, in fertile soil and empty fields. It speaks in the mood of the people. A ruler who cannot read the river is blind." Cleo listened to his words as though they were a lullaby made of truth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not empty. It was full of thought, full of the lamp's gentle crackle, full of distant night sounds. Then Cleo said, almost to herself, "People think power is loud." The scholar's eyes remained on her. "And what do you think?" Cleo's voice was steady. "I think power is quiet," she said. "Like the night, like the river, like a hand placed gently but firmly on a door so it cannot be pushed open." The scholar nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "Power that shouts is often afraid. Power that whispers is often certain." Cleo felt something settle inside her, not as excitement, but as clarity. It was like watching the moon's reflection stop trembling when the wind paused. Yet clarity did not remove the heaviness she carried. In the palace, she had begun to notice how rooms could change when certain people entered, how laughter could thin into politeness, how servants could become almost invisible, moving like shadows, how names could be spoken with sweetness, and then, later, with contempt. She had begun to understand that her family was not simply a family. It was a court. It was a structure. It was a place where affection and danger could sit on the same cushion. There were days when she saw her father in the distance, surrounded by advisors. His voice carried, and people listened. He seemed solid, like a statue. But Cleo had watched him too closely to believe in statues. She had seen the way his expression tightened when a messenger arrived with news from beyond Egypt. She had seen how quickly he could become tired when the room emptied. Once, she had passed by a doorway and heard a conversation stop mid-sentence. She had heard her own name in it, spoken softly, as if it were fragile. That was when she understood something important. Even when you are not in the room, you can still be present. Your name can sit at a table without you. That thought had followed her for days, like a shadow that did not frighten her but did not leave. Now, in this quiet room, she spoke again, carefully. "Teacher," she said, and her voice sounded younger when she used the word. "How does one remain gentle in a place that is not gentle?" The scholar looked at her for a long moment, and in his gaze there was no deception. "You do not remain gentle by being weak," he said. "You remain gentle by choosing what you will harden and what you will protect." Cleo swallowed softly, as if the words had weight. "And what should I protect?" she asked. The scholar's answer was simple. "Your mind," he said. "Your clarity. Your ability to see. When you lose those, you become like everyone else, moved by fear rather than guided by understanding." Cleo felt the truth settle in her bones. Outside, the wind moved again, soft as breath. It slipped through the window's small opening, stirring the flame. The light trembled, then steadied. Cleo reached for the scroll of the treaty again. She unrolled it further and began to read, not as a student reading to pass a lesson, but as someone learning to hear what is not said. She noticed phrases that seemed generous yet left room for taking. She noticed promises that depended on circumstances, and circumstances that could be shaped by those with power. She noticed how a single word could carry two meanings, one bright for the public, one dark for those who understood. As she read, she imagined the men who had negotiated it. She imagined their hands, their voices, their smiles. She imagined what they wanted, and then she imagined the people of Egypt, the farmers, the fishermen, the women carrying jars of water, the children running barefoot on warm ground. She imagined them not as symbols, but as lives. She had begun to learn that ruling was not only about defending a throne, it was about protecting ordinary mornings. The scholar watched her, and he did not interrupt. He knew that this was the kind of learning that could not be forced. After a long while, Cleo rolled the scroll back up. "I think I understand it more," she said. "What do you understand?" the scholar asked. Cleo's fingers rested on the papyrus. "I understand that agreements are like boats," she said. "They look stable when they are on calm water. But when the wind changes, you learn what they are made of." The scholar's eyes brightened slightly. "Good," he said. "Then you are learning how the world truly moves." Cleo leaned back in her chair. For a moment she looked tired. Not sleepy yet, but tired in the way a mind becomes tired after holding many thoughts at once. The scholar stood slowly. His joints moved with the careful effort of age. "That is enough for tonight," he said. "You have held the day long enough. Let it go." Cleo did not argue. She rose as well, gathering her scrolls. Her movements were quiet, almost ceremonial, as if she were honoring the night's calm. They walked together toward the door. The corridor beyond was dim, with lamps spaced far apart, like small islands of light in a sea of shadow. As they stepped out, Cleo paused and looked down the corridor toward the distant rooms where decisions were made, where voices still sometimes lingered late into the night. She could not hear them now, but she knew they existed. She could feel them the way one feels weather changing before it arrives. The scholar followed her gaze. "You are thinking again," he said, not accusing, only observing. Cleo nodded slightly. "I am thinking," she said, "that I am being shaped." The scholar's voice lowered, becoming almost the same as the wind. "Yes," he said, "and one day you will shape others. The question is whether you will do it with fear or with understanding." Cleo's hand tightened briefly around her scrolls. "I do not want to be ruled by fear," she said. "Then keep listening," the scholar answered. "Listen to people. Listen to silence. Listen to yourself. Fear is loud, but truth is steady." They walked again. Their footsteps were soft. The palace seemed to hold them carefully, as if it too wanted them to rest. When Cleo reached her chamber, the air inside was cool. Thin curtains moved gently. A small lamp burned near her bed, making the fabrics look like pale clouds. She set the scrolls down and stood for a moment in stillness. The day's voices felt far away now, like a distant marketplace fading after sunset. She walked to the window and looked out. In the distance, beyond the city lights, she could sense the Nile moving. She could not see it clearly from here, but she felt its presence like a heartbeat that never stopped. She thought of her earlier words. She thought of power as quiet. She thought of doors and keys and rivers that spoke in flood and drought. She placed her palm against the cool stone of the window frame. One day, she told herself, I will be able to read the world as easily as I read a scroll. But the thought did not excite her like a child's dream. It softened her like a lullaby, because it carried responsibility, and responsibility had its own heavy calm. She turned from the window and lay down. The bed's fabrics welcomed her. The lamp's flame was small. It did not demand attention. Cleo closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw the map of the Mediterranean, the names of cities like distant constellations. She saw the treaty's words like thin threads that could bind or cut. She saw the faces of people who spoke one thing and meant another. She saw the Nile, dark and shining, flowing through everything, indifferent to the palace yet essential to it. The room was quiet enough that she could hear her own breathing. Slowly, the thoughts loosened their grip. They did not vanish, but they became softer, like cloth settling after being folded. The night wrapped itself around her, not like a trap, but like protection. Outside, Alexandria slept beneath the moon. The sea breathed. The palm leaves whispered. Somewhere, the Nile continued its steady movement through darkness, carrying with it the patience of time. And in the palace, Cleo drifted into sleep, her mind still holding the shape of lessons not spoken loudly, but planted gently, as if history itself were teaching her in the language of quiet power. Night came again, as it always did, patient and certain, settling over Alexandria like a soft cloak. The sky darkened into a deep indigo, and the moon rose with the calm dignity of something that never needed to hurry. Its light rested on marble steps and quiet courtyards, on the pale faces of statues, on the still water and fountains that murmured as if speaking to themselves. Inside the palace, the air held a different kind of silence than it used to. It was not the silence of rest alone. It was the silence that arrives when people are listening for something they cannot name. Doors closed more carefully. Footsteps were lighter in the corridors. Even the oil lamps seemed to burn with a cautious steadiness, their flames trembling at the smallest shift of air. Cleo felt it everywhere. She had grown into herself in small, invisible ways, not in the way cloth grows looser with time, but in the way a river shapes stone without ever raising its voice. Her face was still young, but her gaze carried an alertness that made others hesitate before speaking too freely. She was no longer the girl who could be dismissed with a smile. She was becoming someone whose presence changed the room, and the palace knew it. That evening, Cleo was called not to a place of study, but to a hall where learning was woven with power. The message came quietly, carried by a servant who did not meet her eyes. The servant's hands shook slightly as he delivered it, and Cleo noticed that too. She noticed everything now, not because she wanted to, but because the palace demanded it. She walked through corridors lined with columns and tapestries. The air smelled faintly of incense, but underneath it was the sharper scent of anxiety, like metal warmed in the sun. She passed closed doors behind which voices softened when she came near. She passed guards who stood straighter than usual, as if their bodies alone could hold order in place. When she reached the hall, she paused at the threshold. The room was lit by many lamps, and yet it felt dim. Light could not fully soften what waited there. A long table stood in the center, and around it sat men whose faces had become familiar over the years. Advisors, officials, scribes, and those whose titles could change while their influence remained. At the far end of the room, her father sat. He looked smaller than Cleo remembered. Not smaller in body, but smaller in presence, as if something had begun to loosen its hold on him. His eyes were tired, and though his posture tried to remain firm, Cleo could see the strain in the set of his shoulders. On the table before him lay scrolls, seals, and a small bowl of water that reflected the lamplight with a trembling shine. Cleo stepped in and bowed with the grace she had been taught. She did not let her movements show hesitation. Her father lifted his gaze. For a moment, something softened in his expression, something close to affection, or perhaps recognition. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality of a king who could not afford tenderness in front of those who watched him. "Come closer," he said. Cleo walked forward and stopped at the place he indicated. She could feel the eyes of the men around the table measuring her, weighing her as if she were an object whose value could be calculated. She did not flinch. She let their gaze pass through her like wind through reeds. Her father's voice was quieter now. "You know why you are here?" Cleo answered truthfully. "I know something is changing." A faint sound moved through the room. Perhaps a breath, perhaps a chair shifting. Her father's fingers rested on the edge of a scroll, as if holding it in place kept the world steady. "The world outside these walls is restless," he said. "Rome watches. The sea carries rumors faster than ships. Our treasury feels lighter than it should. Our allies speak in sweeter tones than before, which is never a good sign." Cleo listened. Her mind kept pace with his words, but her heart remained calm, as if it had learned that panic was useless. She had been trained by silence. "And inside these walls," her father continued, "things are restless too." He did not name what he meant. He did not need to. The palace itself was a living thing, full of hunger and shifting loyalty. Cleo had seen how quickly people could bow to one name today and whisper another tomorrow. Her father's eyes rested on her. "You are my daughter," he said, "and you are Ptolemy. Blood is not enough. Understanding is what keeps the blood from being spilled." Cleo heard the unspoken sentence beneath that one. Understanding is what keeps you alive. She did not reply immediately. She waited, as if allowing his words to settle into the air. Then she said softly, "What do you want from me?" Her father's mouth tightened for a moment. He looked older than he should have looked. "I want you," he said, "to be ready." Ready was a word that could hold many meanings. Ready to rule, ready to negotiate, ready to survive. One of the advisors leaned forward. His voice was smooth, practiced. "The line of succession must be secured," he said, as though speaking of property rather than life. "The people must see continuity." Another man spoke, quieter but sharper. "Continuity prevents rebellion." Cleo did not look at them. She kept her gaze on her father. He nodded once, as if agreeing with them and resenting them at the same time. "There will be announcements," he said. "Ceremonies. The court must be calmed." Cleo understood. This was the beginning of her being placed on the board. Not later, not someday, but now. A strange stillness moved through her. It was not joy. It was not fear. It felt like standing at the edge of a river in the dark, knowing you will have to step in, whether the water is warm or cold. Her father reached for a small object near the scrolls. It was a seal, gold, heavy, engraved. He held it up so the lamplight caught it. The metal glowed, faintly. "This seal," he said, "carries authority. It makes words real. It turns ink into law." He placed it down again, but the sound it made on the table felt louder than it should have. Cleo looked at the seal, and thought of what her teacher once said: meaning shifts because people shift. Now she saw the truth of it more clearly. Meaning was shifting toward her. Her father's voice softened again, as though speaking only to her. You have learned languages. You have learned to read people. You have learned to listen. Cleo's throat tightened slightly, but her face remained calm. I need you, he said, to learn something else. Cleo waited. He said, you must learn to stand where others want to push you down. The words were quiet, but they struck her with the weight of prophecy. The meeting ended in the way such meetings always ended, without open drama, only with decisions sealed into place, carried out later by hands that belonged to servants and scribes. Men rose from their seats, bowed, murmured, and drifted away like smoke. Cleo remained. Her father dismissed the others with a small gesture. When the room finally emptied, the lamps seemed to burn differently, as if relieved to no longer witness politics. He looked at her again, and this time his gaze held something raw. You are still young, he said, and his voice almost broke on the word. I wanted you to have more time. Cleo did not pretend to be comforted. She spoke simply. Time does not belong to us. Her father's eyes closed briefly, as though he were tired of fighting even the truth. Then he said, they will try to bind you. Cleo asked, who? He opened his eyes. Everyone, he said. The word hung in the air like dust in lamplight. Cleo felt a chill, but she did not move. She had long understood that danger in the palace was not a sudden blade. It was a slow hand. It was a smile. It was a promise. Her father reached toward her hand. His fingers were warm, but unsteady. Do not let them make you small, he said. Do not let them convince you that you are only a symbol. Cleo swallowed. What am I then? Her father studied her. You can be the river, he said at last. Not the stone that the river moves around. Cleo did not fully understand, and yet she did. She felt the shape of the meaning, even if she could not yet hold it like a clear object. When she left the hall, the corridors seemed longer. The palace felt different now, as if a line had been crossed. She walked slowly, not because she was hesitant, but because she was listening. Listening to the building itself, to the way silence gathered and dispersed, to the way shadows leaned against doorways. In her chamber, a lamp burned low. Thin curtains stirred in the night air. The bed looked soft, inviting, but her mind did not want softness yet. She walked to the window. Beyond the palace walls, Alexandria slept. The sea was a dark expanse, barely visible, but its presence could be felt in the cool, salt air. Somewhere beyond the city, the Nile moved, unseen but steady. Cleo rested her palm against the stone frame. She thought of crowns. She had seen them worn, seen them placed on heads with ceremony and music. She had thought of them as glittering objects, as symbols. Now she realized they were also weights. They pressed into flesh. They made the neck ache. They forced you to keep your head lifted even when you wanted to bow. She thought of the seal her father had held, the way it turned words into law. She thought of treaties and boats, of wind that could change. She thought of fear and truth, of loudness and quiet. And then, in the stillness, another memory rose. Her teacher's voice. Power that whispers is often certain. Cleo breathed in slowly. She understood now that she was being asked to become certain. Not the kind of certainty that shouts and demands, but the kind that holds steady in the dark. The kind that does not collapse when people lean against it. She stayed by the window until the lamp behind her flickered lower, until the night air cooled her skin, until her thoughts began to soften at the edges. Eventually, she lay down. The fabric settled around her like gentle waves. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come at once. Instead, she drifted into a quiet space between waking and dreaming, where ideas moved like shadows across water. In that half-dream, she saw a crown, not on her head, but hovering above her like the moon. Beautiful, distant, and heavy with light. She saw hands reaching for it. Some hands offered it. Some hands wanted to take it. Some hands wanted to control the way it sat. And beneath all of it, she saw the Nile. Dark, patient, endless. Flowing through fields, through cities, through palaces, through time. When she finally fell asleep, it was not the sleep of a child who trusts the world without question. It was the sleep of someone who has begun to feel the world's weight and has decided quietly to carry it. Outside, Alexandria remained under the moon. The sea breathed, the gardens whispered, and the palace, with all its hidden hunger and careful smiles, stood still for a few hours, as if even it needed to rest before the next day asked for more. In the quiet of the night, Cleo's mind held one thought, clear as the moon's reflection in calm water. I will not be made small. And the night, gentle and old, seemed to accept her vow without needing any words at all. Night arrived in Alexandria as if it had been invited, stepping softly through the city and settling into the palace with quiet certainty. The sky was clear, and the stars looked like distant lamps hung carefully in place. The moon rose pale and steady, laying a calm light over the courtyards, the columns, the sleeping gardens. Even the sea seemed to breathe more slowly, its waves smoothing their voices against the shore. Inside the palace, the silence had changed again. It was not only the hush of late hours, it was the hush of waiting, the kind that gathers when a story is about to turn. The servants moved with more care than usual. Doors closed gently, as if sound itself could be dangerous. Lamps burned in a cautious line along the corridors, their flames small and steady, like watchful eyes. Cleo walked through it all without rushing. She had learned that haste belonged to fear, and fear, though common, was never wise in a palace like this. She was queen now in name, and in the way others began to step aside when she passed. Yet the crown she wore was not always visible. Sometimes it was only a weight in her mind, a steady pressure behind her thoughts. The palace still held old loyalties, old rivalries, old hands reaching for control. It was a place that could smile at you while quietly measuring where you might break. And beyond the palace walls, the world had begun to press closer. Rome's shadow lay across the Mediterranean like a long cloud. It did not always arrive with armies. Sometimes it arrived with envoys, with contracts, with assistance offered in a voice so polite it could be mistaken for kindness. Rome's power moved like tidewater. It could pull a country toward it slowly, until one day the shore was no longer where it had been. Cleo had felt that tide for months. She felt it in the advisors who spoke more often of Roman interests than Egyptian needs. She felt it in the whispered names that drifted through halls late at night. She felt it in the way merchants began to mention Roman generals as if they were weather, unavoidable, changing, and worth paying attention to. Now, on this night, the tide had come to the door. A messenger had arrived earlier, breathless but controlled, his eyes wide with the kind of urgency that tried to hide itself. The words were delivered quickly and quietly, as though speaking them aloud could make them heavier. A Roman leader was near, not a rumor this time. not a name carried by sailors and traders, a presence, Julius Caesar. Cleo stood at her window for a long time after she heard it, letting the information settle. Outside, the city lay calm beneath moonlight, as if nothing in the world had changed. But she knew how quickly calm could be replaced. She knew that even the river, steady as it was, could rise in a single season and reshape the land. She pressed her fingertips against the cool stone of the frame. The Nile had always taught patience. Rome had taught calculation. She would need both. When the palace finally quieted toward midnight, Cleo did not go to sleep. Instead, she moved through her rooms with a kind of deliberate stillness, gathering small things that mattered. A simple cloak, a narrow scroll case, a ring that bore her seal. She was not dressing for ceremony. She was dressing for movement. A soft knock came at the door. One of her closest attendants entered, eyes lowered in respect, but face tense with concern. The attendant's voice was barely more than breath. "The city speaks," she said. "They say the Romans are already here or nearly here." Cleo nodded once. "They would speak even if the sea itself were marching," she replied. The attendant hesitated. "And the palace? The palace is divided." Cleo did not ask how. She already knew. Division lived here like dust. You could wipe it away, but it returned. She stepped closer to the lamp, letting its light touch her face. In the mirror's dim reflection, she saw herself, young, composed, and very awake. "Do you remember?" Cleo asked quietly. "What the river does when it meets stone?" The attendant looked uncertain. "It moves around it," she said. "Yes," Cleo replied. "Or it wears it down. But it never stops being the river." She turned away from the mirror. "Tonight," she said, "I will meet Rome." The attendant's eyes widened slightly. "Here, in the palace?" Cleo's gaze remained calm. "Not like this," she said, and with those words, she stepped into the night. They did not move with a procession. There were no banners, no musicians, no bright torches announcing her passage. That kind of arrival belonged to people who wanted to display power. Cleo wanted to preserve it. She went out through a quieter corridor, down a stairway that servants used, past a side courtyard where the fountain whispered in the moonlight. The air smelled of water and stone and a faint trace of jasmine. The night was cool enough to feel clean. A small boat waited at a hidden landing, its shape barely visible against the dark water. A few trusted hands were there, silent, steady, loyal not to noise but to her. No one spoke more than necessary. The boat slipped into the canal and then toward the open river, moving with the gentlest rhythm. Cleo sat low beneath the cloak, letting the darkness hold her, above them. The moon watched as it always did, indifferent and patient. The Nile carried them. For a moment, as the boat glided, Cleo let herself remember what it felt like to be a child, listening to stories by lamplight. She remembered asking if the Nile remembered anyone. She remembered the answer. It touches hands that are gone. It reflects faces that are forgotten. Tonight, she thought, it will reflect a face from Rome. The journey was not long, but it felt long in the way significant things feel long. Each stretch of water was a breath. Each shadow along the shore was a thought. Eventually, they reached the place where the Romans were lodged, near enough to the city to be connected, but separate enough to feel in control. The camp was quieter than she expected. Roman discipline held sound in check. Torches burned in measured intervals. Guards stood like statues, not moving much, but seeing everything. Cleo's attendants moved carefully. The plan was simple, and simplicity was safer. She would not approach as a pleading queen at the gates. She would arrive as an inevitability. She was brought forward not in splendor, but in subtlety. Not as a spectacle, but as a presence. When she entered the space where Caesar was said to be, the air felt warmer, heavy with lamplight and human breath. The room was not lavish, it was functional, arranged for a man who could sleep anywhere and still wake as if he owned the morning. Julius Caesar stood near a table, bent over maps. His posture was controlled, his movements economical. He did not look up immediately when she arrived, as if he had learned to hear the world without needing to see it. Only when the space had fully acknowledged her presence did he lift his gaze. Cleo met his eyes without flinching. He was older than her, with a face shaped by years of decision. His expression was calm, but not soft. Calm like a blade that has been polished. His eyes held the steadiness of someone who believed the world could be arranged if one had enough will. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. In that moment, Cleo felt the weight of history gathering like a quiet storm. Not loud, not violent, just inevitable. Caesar spoke first, and his voice was measured. "So," he said, "Egypt's queen comes to me at night." Cleo did not smile widely. She let only a small curve touch her lips, the kind that suggested she was not afraid of the darkness. "Night is when the city is honest," she replied. "In daylight, everyone performs." Caesar's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in interest. "And what brings you," he asked, "to my honesty?" Cleo stepped forward just enough to be seen clearly. She did not bow deeply. She did not demand. She held her posture as one holds a line of music, steady, controlled, certain. "My country," she said simply. Caesar glanced down at the map again, then back at her. "Your country is on my table," he said, tapping the parchment lightly. "It has been on many tables." Cleo's voice remained soft. "And yet it is still mine." The room was quiet. Cleo could feel the attention of Roman officers nearby, the watchers in shadow. She could sense their surprise that a young woman spoke with such calm. She did not seek to impress them. She sought only to remain herself. Caesar studied her in that careful way powerful people study the world, looking for weakness, for leverage, for hidden hunger. "You speak Greek," he noted. "I speak more than Greek," Cleo replied. "But Greek is the bridge you chose." For the first time, Caesar's expression softened by a fraction, as if he appreciated a mind that could move quickly. "You understand bridges," he said. "I understand rivers," Cleo answered. Caesar watched her a moment longer. "Then you understand that rivers can be redirected." Cleo did not disagree. She did not argue. She only said, "They can, but they always seek, the sea." Something passed through Caesar's gaze. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of it. He turned slightly, gesturing toward a seat. "Sit," he said. Cleo sat, not as a guest begging for favor, but as a ruler acknowledging another ruler. The chair was plain. She sat as if it were a throne. Caesar moved to the opposite side of the table, the map between them like an ocean made of ink. "Egypt," he said, "has debts." Cleo nodded. "Yes." "Egypt has internal disputes," he continued. "Yes." "Egypt has a throne that attracts those who think they can sit on it," he added, his voice almost mild. Cleo looked at him steadily. "Yes." Caesar's fingers rested on the edge of the parchment. "Then tell me," he said, "why should Rome care which hand holds that throne?" Cleo did not answer quickly. She listened first, as she had been taught. There was a question beneath the question. There was always a question beneath. Finally, she said, "Because stability benefits Rome as much as it benefits Egypt." Caesar's expression did not change. "Stability," he repeated, "is a Roman word when Rome controls it." Cleo felt the truth in that, but she did not let it cut her. "Then let us speak honestly," she said. Caesar tilted his head slightly. "Go on." Cleo's voice remained quiet, but it carried. "Egypt does not need Rome's shadow to breathe," she said. "But Egypt can choose to work with Rome rather than be crushed beneath it. If Rome wants grain, trade, and calm waters, then Rome benefits from a queen who can provide them." Caesar's eyes watched her carefully. "And you believe you are that queen?" Cleo did not hesitate. "I believe I can be," she said. "Because I listen. Because I know this land. Because I can speak to its people in their own tongue. Because I understand that power does not only come from armies, it comes from order, from seasons, from the river." Caesar was silent for a while. In that silence, Cleo sensed him weighing her words, her posture, the steadiness in her voice. She sensed him imagining what she could offer, not only in gold or grain, but in alignment. He finally spoke, and when he did, his tone remained calm. "Rome does not love," he said. "Rome calculates." Cleo's gaze did not waver. "Then calculate," she replied. A faint breath of amusement moved through Caesar, very slight, as if he appreciated that she was not pretending Rome would be gentle. He stepped closer to the table and traced a line on the map, along the Mediterranean, toward Egypt. "You are positioned well," he said, "and you are vulnerable." Cleo replied, "So is everyone. Vulnerability is simply what we hide." Caesar looked at her again, and his eyes held something like approval. "You are not a child," he said. Cleo answered softly, "No." The lamplight flickered, then steadied. Outside, the Roman torches burned in disciplined silence. The night wrapped the camp as if it wanted to keep secrets. Their conversation continued, not as a dramatic exchange, but as a slow turning of stones in the hand. They spoke of debts, of alliances, of the river's harvest, and the city's moods. Cleo did not overpromise. She did not plead. She spoke as one who understood that trust was not given freely, but built like a bridge plank by plank. At one point, Caesar asked, "And what do you offer me personally, Cleopatra?" The question was quiet, but it carried a sharp edge. Cleo paused. She knew this question was not only political, it was human. It was about proximity, influence, control. It was about the strange spaces where power and intimacy sometimes touched. She answered with care. "I offer you clarity," she said, "in a place where people speak with two tongues. I offer you a partner in stability, not a puppet. I offer you Egypt standing, not Egypt burning." Caesar studied her. The silence that followed was long, but not uncomfortable. It felt like watching the Nile at night. Slow, steady, full of depth. Finally, Caesar nodded once. "Very well," he said. "You will have protection." Cleo did not let relief show too brightly. Relief in a palace or a camp could be mistaken for weakness. She only nodded in return, as if accepting something that had always been possible. "And in return," Caesar continued, "Egypt remains useful." Cleo's voice was soft. "Egypt remains Egypt," she said. Caesar's eyes held hers. "We will see," he replied. When she left his presence later, the night air felt cooler, as though the world had exhaled after holding its breath. The Roman camp remained quiet, controlled, like a machine at rest. Cleo walked back toward the river without haste. She was not giddy. She was not triumphant. She felt something more subtle. She felt the world's attention shift. She felt a door open, one that could lead to shelter or to a new kind of trap. By the water's edge, the small boat waited again, dark against the moonlit surface. Cleo paused before stepping in and looked at the river. The Nile moved with the same steady patience it always had. It did not care about Rome. It did not care about Caesar. It did not care about the palace or the throne. It simply carried water, carried silt, carried life. And yet, Cleo thought, everything depends on it. As the boat glided back toward Alexandria, the city appeared again in the distance, its lights scattered like fallen stars. The palace rose pale and still. From far away, it looked peaceful, almost innocent. Cleo knew better. Inside its walls, people would already be adjusting their words, already shifting loyalties, already telling themselves new stories about what her meeting meant. Some would feel threatened. Some would feel relieved. Some would pretend not to notice anything at all. Cleo sat low in the boat and let the night hold her. She thought of Caesar's face, composed and watchful. She thought of Rome's calculating calm. She thought of the way he had said Rome does not love. And she thought of her own earlier question, asked in childhood. Does the Nile remember anyone? Perhaps not in the way people remember, but it carried everyone. It carried the footsteps of farmers and kings. It carried the reflections of faces that history would later carve into stone. Tonight, it had carried her toward Rome and back again. When she reached her chamber, the lamp inside had burned low. The curtains moved gently. The room smelled faintly of oil and night air. Cleo removed her cloak and sat by the window. She did not immediately lie down. She needed to let the night settle inside her, to let the edges of the meeting soften into something she could hold without tension. Outside, Alexandria slept beneath the moon. The sea breathed. The gardens whispered. The palace stood still. But within it, the quiet machinery of ambition never fully rested. Cleo placed her hand on the stone frame again, feeling its cool steadiness. She had met Rome, not on her knees, not with loud defiance, but with the calm of someone who understood that the strongest currents do not announce themselves with noise. She closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw a map. Egypt like a jewel on the edge of water, Rome like a shadow stretching long. She saw a river flowing through it all, indifferent yet essential. And she felt, very quietly, the first true shape of what her life would become. Not a simple story of a queen in a palace, but a story of a woman standing where empires touched. A story of quiet power, moving carefully through night, trying to remain the river even when the world demanded she become stone. At last, her breathing slowed, the thoughts loosened. Sleep came not as an escape, but as a brief shelter. Outside, the Nile continued its steady movement through darkness, carrying the patient weight of time, carrying Cleopatra forward, even when she could not yet see where the current would finally lead. Night returned to Alexandria with the same gentle certainty, as if the world still wished to pretend that nothing could truly change. The moon rose pale over the harbor, turning the sea into a dark mirror with trembling silver edges. The city's lights softened behind curtains and shutters. In the palace gardens, the palms moved slowly in the wind, whispering in a language older than politics. And yet, beneath the quiet, the palace was awake. It was awake in the way a guarded heart is awake, in the way a room stays alert after hearing a sound in the dark. The corridors still held their lamps, but the flames seemed smaller tonight, as if they knew they were being watched. Cleo sat alone near a low table, a lamp beside her, its flame flickering with a patient rhythm. In front of her lay a handful of scrolls, some opened, some tied shut. Wax seals caught the light like small, sleeping suns. A shallow bowl of water reflected the flame, the reflection trembling whenever the night wind slid through the window. She watched the reflection more than the flame itself. It reminded her of something she had learned too early, that even steady things can tremble, and trembling does not always mean breaking. Outside, the Nile moved through darkness beyond the city, unseen but present. Cleo could feel it in the night air, in the memory of its scent, in the way her thoughts always returned to it, like a hand returning to a familiar stone. She had met Rome, and Rome had not disappeared. Caesar's presence in Egypt had been like a new constellation in the sky, impossible to ignore once seen. It reshaped the way people spoke, the way they moved, the way they imagined tomorrow. Some had welcomed him openly. Others had bowed while quietly resenting the shadow his name cast over their land. Cleo had watched everything with a calm face. She had learned, in the months since that night, that survival was often an act of balance. Not balance like stillness, but balance like walking along a narrow edge with the sea on one side and stone on the other. You could not afford to sway too far. You could not afford to close your eyes. The palace had remained divided, but the division had become more careful. People had learned that Cleo did not shout. She listened. She remembered. She responded with timing rather than temper. This frightened some of them more than anger would have. On the table beside her lay reports from the southern lands, notes on water levels, crop forecasts, the condition of canals. Another scroll carried numbers about grain storage and distribution. Another described unrest in a village where taxes had been collected too harshly, leaving bitterness that could grow like weeds. Cleo read them one by one, slowly. She did not read as if consuming information. She read as if placing stones carefully to build a path. A soft knock sounded at her door. An attendant entered quietly, head lowered. The attendant's hands carried a small tray with warm tea, faintly scented with herbs. The aroma rose like a gentle hand, offering comfort without demand. Cleo nodded in thanks, and the attendant lingered just long enough to speak. "The council awaits your response," the attendant said, voice low. "They ask whether the levy on the northern merchants will remain." Cleo's eyes stayed on the scroll in her hands. "Tell them," she said, "the levy will be adjusted, not removed. The merchants will complain, but they will still trade. Hunger complains louder than merchants." The attendant hesitated. "They will say you are harsh." Cleo lifted her gaze. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were clear. "Let them say it," she replied. "Harshness is taking without purpose. This is taking to feed." The attendant bowed and left. Cleo turned back to the scrolls. This was what rule had become, day after day. Not a crown glinting under sunlight. Not a throne that made the world kneel. It was paper, ink, numbers, water levels, shipments, negotiations, and the quiet tension of knowing that if she made the wrong decision, people would not merely be displeased. They would starve. They would riot. They would die. She had not asked for that weight, and yet it sat on her shoulders as if it had always belonged there. Cleo rose and walked toward the window. The palace gardens lay below, washed in moonlight. The fountain's water caught the silver glow and returned it in trembling patterns. Beyond the gardens, the city spread out, sleeping. The harbor was a darker patch, the sea a deeper one. Somewhere out there, ships rested, their hulls heavy with goods and expectation. She thought of Rome again. Caesar had remained near for a time, a force both protective and invasive. There were moments when his presence had felt like stability, because it held certain enemies at bay. But it was never without cost. Rome's protection was a hand that expected to be kissed. Cleo had learned to accept what she needed without forgetting what it meant. She had also learned something else, something quieter and more personal. In the days that followed her meeting with Caesar, she had watched him not only as a Roman leader but as a man. She had listened to the way he spoke, not loudly, but with the certainty of someone who believed the world could be shaped. She had noticed how he grew still when thinking, how he could turn from tenderness to strategy without warning, as if both lived in him without conflict. Some in the palace had tried to turn that connection into rumor, into scandal, into a story designed to make her seem less than a ruler. Cleo had not fed the stories. She had simply kept her posture steady, letting the gossip lose interest when it found no dramatic reaction. Power, she had learned again, could be quiet. Yet even quiet power could not prevent all things from changing. One night, not long after, the news came. Caesar was dead. The words arrived like cold water. A messenger spoke them in a low voice, as if raising it might fracture the walls. The message traveled through the palace like a shadow. Servants whispered, advisors gathered. The air itself seemed to tighten. Cleo heard the news and did not move for a long time. She sat by a lamp, the flame flickering. The bowl of water beside it trembled as if the river itself had shivered. Caesar's death did not only mean the loss of a man, it meant the loss of a structure, of a temporary stability that had held certain forces in place. It meant Rome's inner turbulence would spill outward. It meant alliances would shift, debts would be reconsidered, ambitions would wake hungry. It meant the tide had changed. That night, Cleo walked to her window, and the moon looked the same as always. The sea breathed, the palm leaves whispered. The city slept. The world did not announce its turning. It simply turned. In the days after, the palace became a place of tense motion. Advisors came and went. Scrolls multiplied. Seals were pressed. Messengers left and returned. Every conversation carried a hidden edge. Cleo did what she had always done. She listened. She listened to which names were spoken more often. She listened to which names were avoided. She listened to the pauses between sentences, to the tightening of hands, to the quickness in eyes that revealed fear. Rome was dividing itself, and divisions were openings. Yet openings could be traps. Cleo began to focus on what she could control. She focused on the river, not as a metaphor, but as reality. She summoned reports from governors along the Nile. She ordered repairs to canals where silt had begun to clog the flow. She instructed that certain granaries be replenished early, before rumors of instability could cause panic buying and hoarding. She reduced unnecessary ceremony. She redirected funds from decorative projects into practical ones: storage, transport, maintenance. Some at court complained that she was diminishing the palace's grandeur. Cleo answered calmly, "A palace can glitter while a country starves. I will not trade bread for shine." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. In the evenings, when the day's demands loosened slightly, she returned to the room of learning. not because she had time for comfort, but because her mind needed steadiness. Scrolls could be honest in a way people were not. One night, her old teacher met her again, older now, his shoulders more bent, his hands trembling slightly when he unrolled papyrus. Yet his eyes remained clear. "You are carrying the kingdom," he said quietly, as if naming what everyone could see but few dared to speak aloud. Cleo sat opposite him. "I am trying," she replied. The teacher's gaze softened. "Trying is not small," he said. "It is what keeps people alive." Cleo looked at the bowl of water on the table, the lamp's reflection trembling. "Sometimes," she said, "I feel I am holding too many threads." The teacher nodded. "A ruler holds threads," he said. "But a wise ruler knows which ones must be held tightly, and which can be allowed to loosen without tearing the whole cloth." Cleo's fingers rested lightly on the edge of a scroll. "Which ones must I hold?" she asked. The teacher answered without hesitation. "Food," he said. "Water, the trust of the people, and your own clarity." Cleo breathed out slowly. "Clarity feels fragile," she admitted. The teacher's voice was gentle. "Fragile things can still endure," he said. "The flame is fragile, and yet it lights the night." Cleo sat in the quiet for a long moment, letting those words settle. Outside, the palace seemed far away, as if it had become only an echo. In this room, it was easier to remember why she ruled at all. Not for titles, not for approval, but for the ordinary lives that depended on steady decisions. The next day, Cleo stood before her council. The men around her looked tired, anxious. The absence of Caesar's shadow had made them feel exposed. They spoke of Rome's factions. They spoke of who might rise, who might fall, who might seek Egypt's wealth or grain to secure their own power. They wanted Cleo to choose quickly. Cleo listened, then spoke with measured calm. "We will not rush toward a new chain," she said. "We will watch, and we will prepare." An advisor leaned forward. "But Rome may demand." Cleo lifted a hand slightly, not in anger but in quiet interruption. "Rome demands what it can take," she said. "Our task is to make taking expensive." The room fell silent. Cleo continued, voice soft but firm. "We will strengthen the granaries. We will stabilize the provinces. We will ensure the river's routes remain clear. And we will send messages that are polite and vague and slow." "Slow?" someone echoed, startled. "Yes," Cleo replied. "Speed is for those who feel they are losing. Let Rome chase itself for a while. We will remain steady." Some faces showed doubt. Some showed relief. Some showed the hidden displeasure of those who wanted drama, because drama made it easier to manipulate outcomes. Cleo did not care. She had learned to prefer steadiness over applause. And so the years moved forward. Not as a series of grand scenes, but as a long, careful weaving. There were seasons when the Nile rose well, and the fields gleamed green. There were seasons when the flood was lower, and Cleo's planners tightened distribution, moving grain like precious metal, making sure the poorest did not fall through the cracks first. There were days when the palace tried to pull her into its games, when relatives and rivals attempted to control her through tradition, through expectation, through whispers about what a queen should be. Cleo met those pressures with quiet firmness. She did not always win every battle in a visible way, but she kept the country from tipping into chaos, and that was a victory few noticed until it was absent. At night, she often returned to the river in her mind. She would sit by her window as the city slept, listening to the distant murmur of water. Sometimes she would imagine the farmers along the Nile, sleeping in small houses, their hands rough from work, trusting that tomorrow the river would still be there. She wondered how many of them knew her name. Perhaps not many, but she wanted them to feel the results of her decisions the way one feels good weather, without having to understand its causes. One night, a report arrived from the south. A canal had collapsed in part, threatening irrigation for several villages. The repair would be costly. Advisors argued that the treasury could not afford it. Cleo read the report slowly, then looked up. "We will repair it," she said. An advisor protested. "Majesty, it will drain resources." Cleo's voice remained calm. "If we do not repair it," she said, "it will drain people." The advisor fell silent. This was her rule. Quiet, practical, rooted in the river's realities rather than the palace's vanity. And yet, the world beyond Egypt did not remain still. Rome's struggle continued, and new figures rose in the space Caesar had left behind. Their names began to arrive at Cleo's table on scrolls, carried by messengers, spoken by merchants. One name, in time, returned again and again: Mark Antony. At first, he was only a distant shape in the Roman storm, a man spoken of with admiration by some and suspicion by others. He was described as bold, as charismatic, as unpredictable. The kind of person who could bring warmth into a room and danger into a country. Cleo did not rush to form an opinion. She watched. She let the years teach her. But each time his name was spoken, she felt the faint tug of an approaching current. Not because of romance, not because of fascination, but because she understood how history moved. It moved through people. It moved through alliances. It moved through the meeting of rivers and seas. And as the years held the kingdom in her hands, Cleo began to sense that another turning was approaching. Another night when the palace's silence would become the silence of waiting again. Another moment when Egypt would have to choose how to meet Rome's tide. That night, as she sat by her lamp, Cleo closed one last scroll and rested her hand on the seal ring beside it. The metal was cool against her skin. Outside, Alexandria slept beneath the moon. The harbor was still. The sea breathed. And somewhere beyond sight, the Nile continued its steady movement through darkness, carrying Egypt forward, carrying Cleo forward, holding the kingdom in its patient flow, even as the world prepared to shift once more. Night settled over Alexandria with a familiar hush, as though the city itself had learned the rhythm of waiting. The moon rose slowly, pale and distant, its light stretching across rooftops and courtyards, slipping through narrow streets, resting briefly on closed doors before moving on. The harbor lay calm, ships anchored in silence, their masts thin lines against the sky. From far beyond the city walls, the Nile continued its unseen journey, steady and indifferent, carrying with it the memory of every season that had passed. Cleo stood alone on a balcony overlooking the gardens. She had ruled long enough now to recognize the feeling in the air. It was not anxiety exactly, nor was it anticipation. It was the subtle tightening that came before change, like the moment just before the river's current shifts after heavy rain far upstream. Nothing had happened yet, and yet everything was already beginning to move. Rome was no longer divided in the same way it had been after Caesar's death. Its inner storms had begun to settle into new shapes. Power was gathering again, concentrating itself into fewer hands. Messages arriving in Alexandria reflected this change. Their tone was firmer, their requests less patient, their expectations clearer. Among those messages, one name appeared more often than the others: Mark Antony. At first, his name had come as rumor carried by traders and sailors. They spoke of his victories, his generosity with soldiers, his appetite for life, his temper that could burn bright and then disappear just as quickly. They spoke of him as a man who lived loudly, who inspired loyalty through presence rather than precision. Later, his name arrived in official scrolls. Titles followed it: authority, command over Rome's eastern territories, responsibility that stretched toward Egypt like a long arm. Cleo read each message carefully, never twice in the same way. She listened not only to the words, but to what lay beneath them. She sensed ambition, but not the cold ambition she had known in Caesar. This was something warmer, less contained, more dangerous precisely because of its warmth. One evening, as the lamp beside her burned low, Cleo set a scroll down and closed her eyes. She did not think of Antony as a man yet. She thought of him as a current, and currents, she knew, could join or collide. The summons came shortly after, not delivered with threat, not wrapped in apology. It arrived as an expectation, written plainly and politely. Mark Antony requested a meeting with the Queen of Egypt. He wished to speak of alliances, of Rome's needs in the East, of the future stability of the region. Cleo read the request once, then again. She felt no fear, nor did she feel excitement. She felt recognition. The river had brought another tide to her door. That night, she did not sleep immediately. She walked through her chambers slowly, touching familiar objects as if grounding herself in what had already been built. The seal, ring rested on the table, its surface worn smooth by years of use. Scrolls lay stacked neatly, marked with careful notes. The lamp's flame flickered, steady but alive. She thought of Caesar, of his controlled calm, his calculating gaze. She thought of how different Rome felt now, how its voice had changed, and she thought of herself. She was no longer the young queen who had met Rome in secrecy beneath the cover of night. She had been shaped by years of decisions, by famine narrowly avoided, by unrest quieted before it erupted. Her power had grown roots. It was not loud, but it was deep. By morning, she had decided, the meeting would take place in Alexandria, not as an act of defiance, but as a statement of presence. If Rome wished to speak with Egypt, Rome would come to Egypt. Preparations began quietly. Not for spectacle alone, though spectacle had its place, but for intention. Cleo understood the language of symbols. She knew how much could be said without words. The city was readied not with excess, but with care. The harbor was cleaned. The streets nearest the palace were cleared and repaired. The gardens were tended, not to impress, but to reflect order. The palace itself was arranged to feel open, welcoming, and unmistakably sovereign. When Antony arrived, he did not come unnoticed. His ships entered the harbor with a confidence that bordered on theatrical. Their sails caught the sunlight, bright against the water. Soldiers lined the decks, relaxed yet alert, their presence both reassuring and unsettling. Music drifted faintly across the water, not martial but celebratory. The city watched. Cleo watched too, standing where she could see without being seen. She noted the way people leaned forward, curious rather than afraid. She noted how the soldiers moved, how discipline and ease coexisted in their posture. She noted how Antony himself stood at the front of the ship, not armored, not hidden, but visible. He looked exactly as described, tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that filled space effortlessly. His expression was open, almost amused, as though he found the world endlessly interesting. Yet his eyes were sharp. They missed little. Cleo did not rush to greet him. She allowed time to do its work. When she finally appeared, it was not in haste, nor in hesitation. She moved through the palace with calm purpose, her attendants following at a respectful distance. Her garments were chosen with care, elegant, distinctly Egyptian, neither modest nor excessive. Gold caught the light softly. Linen moved like water with each step. When she entered the hall prepared for their meeting, Antony was already there. He turned when she arrived, and for a brief moment, his expression shifted, not into awe, but into something closer to recognition, as if he had expected many things, but not exactly this. Cleo met his gaze without smiling too quickly. "Queen of Egypt," Antony said, his voice warm, carrying easily through the space. "You receive Rome generously." Cleo inclined her head slightly. "Egypt receives those who come with clarity," she replied. "Welcome to Alexandria." Antony smiled then, openly. "I had heard you were impressive," he said. "I see now that hearing was insufficient." Cleo did not respond to the compliment directly. She gestured toward the seats prepared for them. "Come," she said. "Let us speak." They sat opposite one another, a low table between them. The room was filled with light, not harsh, not dim. Outside, water moved softly in the fountains. The air smelled faintly of citrus and stone. Antony studied her with unconcealed curiosity. "You are not what Rome expects," he said. Cleo raised an eyebrow slightly. "Rome expects many things," she replied, "often all at once." He laughed, a genuine sound. "That is true," he admitted. "Rome is rarely satisfied." "And yet," Cleo said, "it continues to ask." Antony leaned back, resting one arm along the chair's edge. His posture was relaxed, but not careless. "Then let me ask plainly," he said. "What does Egypt want?" Cleo appreciated the directness. "Stability," she said. "Autonomy? And a relationship with Rome that does not drain Egypt to feed Roman ambition." Antony's smile faded into something more thoughtful. "Rome's ambition feeds Rome," he said. "That will not change." Cleo nodded. "Nor will Egypt's need to survive." They regarded one another in silence for a moment. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It felt like the pause before a dance, when both partners are learning the other's rhythm. Antony broke it first. "You understand politics," he said. "But I wonder if you understand people." Cleo met his gaze steadily. "I rule people," she said. "I have no choice but to understand them." Antony's eyes lingered on her face. "Then you understand me," he said. Half a statement, half a question. Cleo did not rush to answer. "I am learning," she said. Their conversation unfolded not as negotiation alone, but as exploration. Antony spoke openly of Rome's needs in the East: grain, loyalty, the assurance that Egypt would not become a point of instability in a region Rome sought to control. He did not hide Rome's expectations, but neither did he frame them as threats. Cleo listened carefully. She spoke of Egypt's history, of the river's cycles, of the delicate balance that kept the country whole. She spoke of how easily unrest could spread if people felt exploited. She spoke not as a subordinate, but as a guardian of something ancient and living. Antony listened in his own way. He did not interrupt often. When he did, it was with questions that showed genuine interest rather than calculation. He asked about the Nile, about festivals, about how Cleo had managed to hold the country together through years of uncertainty. At one point, he said, "You rule differently than most." Cleo replied, "Most rule as if they will not be remembered." Antony smiled again, softer this time. "And you?" "I rule as if the land itself is watching," she said. That answer stayed with him. As the hours passed, something shifted. Not in the political terms alone, though progress was made there. Agreements began to take shape, not written yet, but imagined. Support in exchange for cooperation, respect in exchange for reliability. But beneath that, another current moved. Antony's warmth met Cleo's steadiness. His openness met her restraint. Where Caesar had felt like stone shaped into order, Antony felt like fire given direction. Cleo noticed how easily he laughed, how quickly his expression changed. She noticed how his attention could be intense, then suddenly expansive, as if the world delighted him even while he sought to command it. She did not mistake this for simplicity. Fire could be as dangerous as cold steel. When evening came, the meeting ended not with finality, but with intention. There would be more discussions, more dinners, more shared spaces. Antony rose and bowed, not deeply, but sincerely. "I look forward to understanding Egypt better," he said. Cleo stood as well. "Understanding takes time," she replied. "The river teaches patience." Antony's eyes brightened. "Then I will learn from the river." That night, Alexandria came alive in a controlled celebration. Music drifted through the palace. Lamps were lit. Food was shared. Wine flowed, but not excessively. Cleo allowed the city to breathe, to feel seen. She moved through the gathering with measured grace, speaking when needed, listening more often. Antony moved differently, laughing, gesturing, drawing people toward him like warmth. They met again briefly near the gardens. "The city loves you," Antony observed. Cleo replied calmly, "The city watches." Antony considered that. You keep your distance," he said. "I keep my balance," she answered. Later, when the night had deepened and most had withdrawn, Cleo returned to her chambers alone. She sat by her window, the familiar lamp beside her, its flame steady. Outside, the city's sounds softened. The harbor rested. The Nile continued its endless movement. She thought of Antony. Not as a romantic figure, not yet, but as a force, a convergence, a meeting of two currents that could flow together or tear at each other's banks. She felt no illusion about what lay ahead. Rome did not give without taking. Antony's warmth did not erase ambition, and she herself could not afford to lose clarity, no matter how compelling the current. She placed her hand on the cool stone of the window frame. The river does not abandon itself when it meets another, she thought. It adapts, it widens, it deepens. As she lay down to rest, her thoughts did not race. They settled slowly, like silt returning to the riverbed after disturbance. Outside, the moon reflected on water. The gardens whispered. The palace stood still, holding within it the quiet knowledge that history was turning again. And in that turning, Cleo remained what she had always sought to be. Not a flame that burned quickly. Not a stone that resisted until it shattered. But a river, meeting another current, aware of its strength, careful with its direction, carrying Egypt forward into a future that would demand everything she had learned, and more. Night settled over Alexandria with a softness that felt almost merciful. The sky was clear, and the moon hung above the harbor like a quiet lantern, turning the water into a long, trembling ribbon of silver. The city's noise had faded into a low hush, as if even the streets had learned to speak more gently when the hours grew late. In the palace gardens, the palms moved slowly in the wind, their leaves whispering against one another in a patient rhythm. Cleo sat by a lamp that burned low, its flame steady and small. A shallow bowl of water beside it caught the light and returned it in a wavering reflection. Sometimes the reflection looked whole. Sometimes it broke into pieces when the wind slipped through the curtains. Cleo watched it as though it were a lesson she had not finished learning. In the days since Antony's arrival, the palace had changed its posture. Not dramatically, not in a way that would invite alarm, but the air carried a new tension, the kind that comes when people sense that the Queen's choices are becoming narrower, more decisive, more dangerous to oppose. Advisors spoke more carefully. Servants listened more closely. Even the silences between conversations felt heavier. Antony had remained in Alexandria longer than many expected. Officially, it was for discussion, for planning, for the careful weaving of alliance. But alliances were never only written on scrolls. They were written in presence, in shared evenings, in the way two people learned one another's rhythms. Cleo met Antony often, sometimes in formal rooms with maps and attendants, sometimes in quieter spaces where the palace's walls seemed less like witnesses and more like shelter. They spoke about the East, about Rome's shifting balance of power, about Egypt's needs. They also spoke of other things: music, stories, the strange loneliness that comes with authority. And yet, beneath every conversation, Cleo felt the steady pressure of the truth. Rome was not a guest. Rome was a tide. And Antony, for all his warmth, was still Rome. Cleo understood this without bitterness. She had never allowed herself bitterness to be loud. Bitterness could become carelessness, and carelessness could become death. Still, there were nights when she wondered how much of herself she could offer without losing her clarity. One evening, after a long council session, Cleo walked alone through the palace corridors. Lamps burned at measured intervals, casting pools of light onto stone floors. Shadows filled the spaces between, deep and quiet. Her footsteps made almost no sound. She passed a doorway and heard voices inside. The voices dropped when she neared, then rose again once she moved beyond. She had heard that pattern all her life, but lately, the whispers felt sharper, more urgent. As she reached a window along the corridor, she paused. Beyond it, the city lay under moonlight, calm and beautiful, unaware of how fragile calm could be. Cleo rested her fingertips against the cool stone and closed her eyes briefly. A memory surfaced. Her teacher's voice long ago. Power that whispers is often certain. Cleo opened her eyes. Certainty was what the palace demanded of her now. Back in her chamber, she found a new scroll waiting on the table. The wax seal bore the markings of a trusted messenger. Cleo broke it carefully, unrolled the parchment, and read by lamplight. The words were concise, but they carried weight. Rome was tightening again. Octavian's name appeared more often in reports, his influence growing, his ability to turn public sentiment into a weapon sharpening by the day. The Roman world was not only fighting with swords, it was fighting with stories, with reputation, with the slow turning of the crowd's mind. And in those stories, Cleopatra was becoming a symbol. Not the complex ruler she knew herself to be, not the careful keeper of a kingdom, but an image Rome could use, a foreign queen, an Eastern temptation, a convenient shape to blame for Roman divisions. Cleo set the scroll down and looked at the lamp flame. It did not change. It simply burned. She thought of how quickly a narrative could become a prison. She thought of how Rome could turn her into a myth and then punish the myth as if it were real. She felt no panic. Panic was a luxury she had never been allowed. Instead, she felt the narrowing of paths. Another knock came, quiet and respectful. An attendant entered, eyes lowered, voice soft. "Antony asks to see you," she said. "He says it is important." Cleo nodded. "Send him." When Antony arrived, he did not carry his usual ease as lightly. His smile was thinner, his gaze more alert. He moved like a man who had been listening to distant thunder. He greeted her, then went straight to the table where the scroll lay. "You've heard," he said. Cleo did not ask what. She simply replied, "Yes." Antony drew a breath, as if steadying himself. "Rome is changing," he said. "It's becoming colder." Cleo watched him closely. "Rome has always been cold," she said. "It only pretends warmth when it benefits." Antony's mouth tightened. "Octavian is not Caesar," he said. "He is something else. He's young, but he understands how to make the people see what he wants them to see." Cleo lifted her gaze. "And what does he want them to see?" Antony hesitated only a moment. "He wants them to see you," he said, "as the reason for everything that frightens them." Cleo's expression remained calm. "Then he is already building the cage," she said. Antony stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Cleo," he said, using her name without titles, "this will not remain words. Words become armies." Cleo's eyes held his. "I know." Silence stretched between them, heavy but steady. The lamp flame trembled slightly, then steadied again. Antony's voice softened. "I came to Egypt because I needed stability," he said. "I found more than that. I found a place where I can breathe." Cleo listened. She did not interrupt. She knew confession, when it arrived, needed space. "But Rome will not forgive me," Antony continued, "if it believes I'm choosing you over it." Cleo answered gently, "Rome does not forgive. It only allows, temporarily." Antony's gaze flickered with frustration, then with something like longing. "Then tell me," he said. "What do we do?" Cleo looked down at the scroll again, then back at him. "We choose," she said quietly, "before they choose for us." Antony exhaled slowly. "A choice," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "And what choice is there?" Cleo's voice remained soft. "The choice is whether Egypt becomes a rumor in Rome's mouth," she said, "or whether Egypt stands as itself." Antony watched her. "And how does it stand?" he asked. Cleo's eyes were calm, but something deep moved behind them. "With alliances that matter," she said. "With preparation. With a narrative we shape, not one we merely endure." Antony's expression sharpened. "You speak like a general," he said. Cleo replied, "I speak like someone who has spent a lifetime watching how people fall." Antony paced a few steps, then stopped. "Octavian will come," he said. "He will push. He will provoke. He wants me to react foolishly so he can call me reckless." Cleo nodded. "Then we do not react foolishly," she said. "We move deliberately." Antony's voice dropped. "If it comes to war—" Cleo lifted a hand slightly, not stopping him, but guiding the tone downward, away from heat. "If it comes to war," she said, "then we will remember what the river teaches." Antony glanced at her, puzzled. "What does the river teach now?" Cleo's gaze turned toward the window, where the night beyond the palace lay calm. "It teaches that force is not always loud," she said. "Sometimes it is persistence. Sometimes it is refusing to be moved." Antony's shoulders eased slightly, as if her steadiness gave him something to hold. "And you," he asked, voice quieter. Are you willing to be seen beside me in this? That question was the heart of everything. Cleo felt its weight. To be seen beside Antony was not only personal, it was political. It was to accept Rome's gaze, Rome's anger, Rome's storytelling. It was to give Octavian what he wanted, an image. But it was also to claim something: legitimacy, partnership, leverage. Cleo had learned that sometimes you had to step into the fire to control how it burned. She did not answer immediately. She walked to the bowl of water and looked into it. The reflection of the lamp flickered like a small moon trapped in a shallow world. Then she spoke. I will not be hidden, she said quietly. I have been watched my whole life. I will not now pretend that visibility is weakness. Antony's eyes held hers. So you choose me, he said, and there was both hope and fear in the way he said it. Cleo corrected him gently. I choose Egypt, she said, and I choose the path that keeps Egypt standing. Antony's expression softened. And if those are the same, he whispered. Cleo's voice remained calm. Then the currents converge, she said. That night they spoke for hours, not in passion, not in dramatic declarations, but in measured planning. They spoke of fleets, of supply lines, of alliances in the east. They spoke of the cities that might hold, and the cities that might hesitate. They spoke of how Octavian's propaganda would work, how rumors could spread faster than ships. Cleo did not let herself be swept into Antony's heat. She steadied it. She offered strategy where he offered force. She offered patience where he offered urgency. And Antony, in turn, offered something she could not create alone. He offered Roman legitimacy. He offered the weight of a name inside Rome's world, even if that weight was contested. Days passed, and the palace began to hum with preparation, quietly, carefully. Cleo did not announce her intentions in grand speeches. She let actions speak. She adjusted taxes to secure resources. She reinforced the harbor defenses. She ensured grain reserves were protected. At the same time, she shaped the visible story. She appeared beside Antony in controlled settings, not as a captive of his presence, but as his equal. She held her posture steady, her expression calm. She used language, ritual, and symbolism to communicate what she wanted the world to understand. Egypt was not being taken. Egypt was choosing. Some in the palace resisted this. An advisor approached her one evening, face tight with worry. Majesty, he said, Rome will call you reckless. They will say you are seducing him. They will say— Cleo raised a hand gently. They will say what benefits them, she replied. We cannot stop Rome from speaking. We can only decide what we make true. The advisor's voice trembled. And if Rome comes with fire? Cleo's gaze remained steady. Then we will meet fire with water, she said, not to extinguish it completely, but to control where it spreads. That night, as the moon rose again over the harbor, Cleo returned to her window. The city below slept in pockets of light and shadow. Somewhere a dog barked once and then went silent. The sea breathed. The palm leaves whispered. Cleo rested her hand on the stone and let her mind drift backward, briefly, to the girl she had been, asking questions about the Nile, listening to stories of pharaohs and ancient dynasties. She wondered what that girl would think now, knowing she had grown into a woman whose choices could pull empires closer or push them away. The thought did not frighten her. It steadied her, because she understood something that had taken years to fully accept. A queen's life was not made of only what she wanted. It was made of what she chose when wanting no longer mattered. The next morning, Cleo stood before a map spread across a table, Antony beside her. Their fingers traced coastlines, ports, routes across water. Their voices remained low, focused. Outside, the palace continued its slow rhythm. Servants moved, officials waited, the city breathed, and beyond all of it, the Nile continued to flow, patient and endless, as if reminding Cleo of what could not be hurried. The choice she had made was not loud. It did not arrive with trumpets or banners. It arrived with quiet commitment, with planning, with the steady acceptance of consequence. And Cleo knew, as she stood there with Antony and looked at the map of a world that was tightening around them, that some choices could not be unmade. Once a river turned, it did not return to the exact path it had left. It only moved forward, carrying everything with it. Night arrived without announcement, the way it always did, as if the world had learned that endings rarely need trumpets. The sky over Alexandria darkened into a deep, quiet blue. The moon rose pale and careful, not bright with celebration, but steady with witness. Its light lay across the harbor like a thin veil, turning the water into a trembling sheet of silver. The city below the palace had grown quieter in recent days, not from peace but from exhaustion. Even the sea seemed to breathe with restraint. In the palace, lamps burned low. Their flames did not dance as freely as they once did. The corridors were still, but not restful. The stillness felt held, as if the walls themselves were listening. Cleo sat alone in her chamber, close to the window. A small oil lamp stood on a low table, its light warm but faint. Beside it, as always, a shallow bowl of water reflected the flame. The reflection trembled slightly, then steadied, then trembled again. Outside, the night wind moved through the curtains, a soft hand passing through cloth. Cleo watched the reflection the way she had watched it for years, not to distract herself, but to remember something simple, that even a small light can hold against the dark. On the table lay scrolls, messages that had arrived too quickly, too heavily, as if time had begun to collapse. Some were sealed with wax, some already opened and reread until the edges felt worn. The words within them carried the weight of loss and inevitability. Octavian was no longer a distant name. He had become a presence in the air, a pressure at the edges of Egypt, a certainty tightening like a knot. The war that had once felt like a possibility had become an aftermath. Ships had been lost, allies had turned, cities had shifted their loyalty the way a person shifts their footing on unstable ground. Antony's strength had frayed under the strain of defeat. The world had not ended in a single dramatic strike. It had ended in a series of small, relentless changes. One port lost, one promise broken, one rumor turning into belief. It was how tides truly defeated a shoreline. Patiently, persistently, without needing to roar. Cleo held a scroll in her hands but did not read it again. She already knew its meaning. Octavian's demands had been clear. Surrender, submission, a parade in Rome, a story written by someone else. Cleo set the scroll down carefully, as if setting down something fragile. She had spent her life learning how to shape stories, how to keep Egypt standing, how to meet Rome without being swallowed. She had not done everything perfectly. No one could. But she had remained the river as long as the banks allowed. Now the banks were collapsing. Outside the chamber, faint footsteps approached. An attendant entered quietly, eyes lowered. Her face was pale with worry, but her movements were controlled, as if she had learned from Cleo that fear should not be allowed to spill. "Majesty," she whispered, "there is news." Cleo nodded once. "Speak." The attendant hesitated, then said softly, "Antony, he is gone." The words fell into the room like a stone into still water. For a moment, Cleo did not move. The lamp flame flickered. The reflection in the bowl broke into trembling fragments. Then Cleo breathed in, slowly, as if drawing the world back into order. "Gone," she repeated, not as disbelief, but as confirmation. The attendant's voice broke slightly. "He believed you were taken. He believed—" She stopped, unable to finish. Cleo understood without needing the rest. Misunderstanding, rumor, desperation, the cruel speed of panic. Antony's fire, once so powerful, had finally turned inward. Cleo's eyes closed for a brief moment. When she opened them again, they were dry. Grief rose in her, but it did not arrive as a wave. It arrived as a deep, steady weight, settling into her chest. She had learned long ago that grief in a palace must be carried quietly. Loud grief invited predators. "Thank you," she said to the attendant. Her voice remained calm. "You may go." The attendant did not want to leave. Cleo could see it, but she bowed and withdrew, pulling the door closed with careful gentleness. Cleo remained alone. The night pressed softly against the window. Far away, the sea breathed. The city slept uneasily, like someone drifting in and out of dreams. Cleo rose and walked toward the window, placing her hand against the cool stone frame. She thought of Antony. Not only the man, but the convergence of currents they had tried to create. They had attempted to bend Rome's tide, to make it meet Egypt's river without drowning it. For a time they had held. For a time they had moved history slightly, even if history resisted. Now, he was gone, and she was still here. Cleo looked down at her hands. These hands had pressed seals into wax, had held scrolls full of treaties and warnings, had touched the heads of children in blessing, had rested on maps while planning how to keep grain moving, how to keep provinces calm, how to keep the river's life flowing into the people's mornings. She had always known that endings were possible, but knowing did not make them lighter. She turned from the window and walked back to the table. The lamp's flame cast a small circle of light, warm and human. Outside of it, the room was shadow. Cleo sat down slowly. For a long time, she did nothing but breathe. Then she began to think, not of despair, but of choices, because even now, at the edge, she still had one thing that belonged to her: choice. Octavian's intention was not merely conquest, it was humiliation. To take Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and turn her into an object in Rome's celebration, a living symbol of Rome's dominance, a story that would outlive her in the most distorted form. Cleo understood the danger of stories more than most. A story could erase a person's truth more completely than death could. She had fought that all her life. She would not end by surrendering her narrative into someone else's hands. The lamp flickered again. The reflection in the bowl trembled and then steadied. Cleo leaned forward and dipped her fingers lightly into the bowl, disturbing the surface. The reflection shattered into ripples, then slowly, patiently, gathered itself back together. She watched. That was what time did. It broke and then it reformed. But some breaks never became whole again. She withdrew her fingers and dried them on a cloth. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. A soft knock came again. This time a different attendant entered. Older, eyes red from holding back tears, but posture still respectful. "Majesty," she said, Octavian's men are closer. They will come to the palace soon. Cleo nodded. I know. The attendant swallowed. What shall we do? Cleo looked at her gently. You will do what you must to live, she said. You will not throw your life away for mine. The attendant's eyes widened, and tears finally slipped free. But Cleo lifted her hand, quieting her. Go, she said softly. Take those you love. Leave if you can. Hide if you must. The river does not stop because one reed bends. The attendant trembled, then bowed deeply, as if trying to pour all her loyalty into the gesture. She left. Cleo was alone again. She stood and moved through the chamber, not hurried, not frantic. She touched the scroll case, the seal ring, the simple objects that had been part of her daily life. They felt suddenly like artifacts already, as if time had begun to turn them into history before her eyes. She paused at a small chest, opened it, and looked at what was inside. Not treasures meant for display, but things meant for endings. A tiny container, a small bundle wrapped in cloth, items kept not with fear, but with awareness. Cleo closed the chest again and rested her palm on its lid. She did not act yet. She returned to the window one last time. The night outside was calm. The moon still shone. The sea still breathed. Somewhere far beyond the city, the Nile continued its steady movement through darkness, indifferent to empires, faithful to the land. Cleo's gaze softened. She remembered herself as a child, sitting by a lamp, listening to her teacher speak of dynasties and statues and temples. She remembered asking if the Nile remembered anyone. Perhaps, she thought, the Nile remembered in the only way that mattered. By carrying, by touching, by reflecting, by continuing. She imagined the farmers along the river, sleeping in small houses unaware of the exact shape of Roman politics, but dependent on the river's rise all the same. She imagined their children, growing, laughing, learning the rhythm of water and soil. Egypt would remain, not as a throne, not as a palace, but as land, as river, as people. A kingdom could fall, and still the country could live. Cleo turned away from the window. She sat again by the lamp and began to write. Not a long letter, not something dramatic. Her hand moved slowly, steadily. She wrote instructions, practical ones, about stores of grain, about who should be trusted with certain keys, about how to protect the temple records. She wrote as a ruler until the end, because that was what she had trained herself to be. When she finished, she sealed the message with her ring. The wax cooled quickly, hardening into certainty. She placed the letter carefully where it could be found by those who would understand it. Then she sat back. The room was quiet enough now that she could hear her own breathing and the faint crackle of the lamp. Cleo did not cry loudly. She did not speak to the walls. She did not curse Rome. Instead, she let herself feel the steady sorrow of what was ending and the steady dignity of choosing how it would end. Her thoughts moved toward Antony again. She remembered him laughing in the gardens, warmth spilling into the air as if the world were not dangerous. She remembered his intensity, his impatience, his fire. She remembered the way he had looked at her when he asked if she would be seen beside him. Cleo's chest tightened. "I was seen," she whispered, so softly it barely shaped the air. "And I was not ashamed." The lamp flame trembled, then steadied. Outside the chamber, sounds began to change. The palace's silence shifted again, becoming more rigid. Voices murmured at a distance. Footsteps, many of them moving with purpose. The end was approaching. Cleo rose. Her movements were slow, as if she were moving underwater. She adjusted her garments with care, not for vanity, but for composure. She placed a simple adornment in her hair, not ornate but meaningful. She wanted to meet whatever came next with the same calm she had carried for years. She returned to the table. She looked once more at the bowl of water. The reflection of the lamp was small, steady, contained. Cleo placed her fingers lightly on the edge of the bowl. Then she took the small bundle from the chest. History would later argue about what happened next, how it happened, what form it took. Stories would bloom like vines around the truth, because Rome would never stop telling its version, and poets would never stop seeking drama. But in this room, in this night, the truth was quieter. The truth was a woman making a final decision with full awareness, not because she wanted death, but because she refused to be turned into a spectacle. She refused to let her life's meaning be written by her enemy's hands. Cleo sat down, the lamp beside her. She held still for a moment, breathing slowly. The night wind moved through the curtain again, cool and gentle, like the touch of the river's air. In her mind, she saw the Nile, dark, patient, endless. She saw it flowing past fields, past villages, past temples, past the place where the palace stood. She saw it carrying moonlight on its surface, breaking it into fragments and then gathering it back together. She saw herself, not as a queen in defeat, but as a girl by the window, listening to water, listening to time, listening to the world that would continue after her. The footsteps outside grew closer. Voices were clearer now, still controlled, but undeniable. Cleo's face remained calm. She lowered her gaze to the letter she had sealed. Then she looked up at the lamp flame one last time. A small light against a vast dark. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that her life had been exactly that. Small in the scale of empires, immense in the scale of the lives she had tried to protect. She closed her eyes. She made her choice. When the door finally opened, the night did not shatter with noise. It remained what it had always been, quiet, patient, indifferent. Outside, Alexandria slept beneath the moon. The sea breathed, the palms whispered, and somewhere beyond all stories, the Nile continued to flow through darkness, carrying Egypt forward, carrying memory forward, carrying the quiet truth of a queen who refused to be made small, who chose, in the last gentle hours of night, to remain the river.